Hello, and welcome to CoreNet Global Brazil session webinar. My name is Renato Fusaro. I am the VP of CoreNet in Brazil. Just to remind all, today the webinar will be in English, okay? January we do in Portuguese. Last week we did in Spanish, but today will be in English due to our today's speaker that will be with us. If it is your first time in CoreNet, I just would like to introduce you to our association. CoreNet Global is one no-profit corporate real estate association with executives in 48 countries who manage the real estate assets for large corporations. CoreNet Global holds conference for networking and professional developing, conducts surveys, and publishing researches and real estate data for use by the media worldwide. So CoreNet in Brazil. So CoreNet has presence in Brazil for the last 15 years. Yeah, and is the chapter with the most events per year, webinars or face-to-face events. You can follow us in the social media. You can see us in the Facebook. You can see us in Instagram. Maíra, could you put it? Yeah, thank you. This is Brazil CoreNet is our page. You can follow us in the LinkedIn. We put a lot of information and good stuff is in the LinkedIn. We can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and also all the webinars that we are doing nowadays and some information for the face-to-face events you can saw in the YouTube. In our channel in YouTube. Please go there and participate with us. And we are come back to the face-to-face event. So next week, we have a breakfast in the morning with Atiye von Hart, with Camila Nagai, that will talk about architecture, design. So it will be a fun and great to see you guys together with us again. I think it's the third event that we're doing face-to-face this year. We are come back to the face-to-face slowly and come back in safety due to the COVID situation now is much more, let's say, under control here in Brazil. But the idea it's back to the normal face-to-face, but keep the webinars. So Maia, could you put the next one? So we are back to the webinars, and the idea it's bring international speakers to share great contents. We have webinars already scheduled, I think, until November, until end of October, November. And please follow us. And the next one will be in July 14. We have a great friend, a great specialist in branding. So Trish Sousa will be with us in July 14, 4 p.m. Brazilian time to talk about environmental branding. So we are keeping talk about workplace, and it'll be a great webinar in July 14. So last week we started talking about workplace. We spoke with Francisco Vasquez from Spain. So he came to us to talk about workplace after pandemic. And we have some, like the Americans say, some haha moments, like from the last webinars, we are have two great aha moments. We have like a work it is what you do, not where you perform the work. And the opposite, change it or move it from the main place to work in the past to option to perform the activity. So it's one of the options that we have to perform our work or our job. So today we have the pleasure to bring Casey Garcia from CBRE, an expert in the workplace, and she came to talk about activity-based workplace to us, to help us to design the office for the future. So it's a great subject. I love the team. A lot of the Brazilians, Casey, sent to me message, oh, that's great. I love this. I try to implement in my company, but people don't understand so much about. So, okay, let's bring a specialist on this. And welcome, Casey. Can you present yourself and where you are based in? And it's your time to talk.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for having me, Renato. I'm so glad to be here. And thanks all of you who are tuning in. The topic of activity-based working is very popular right now since we've lived through the pandemic, and hybrid is all the rage. So I'm really excited to dive into this topic with you all. I am based in Los Angeles, and I'm with a company called CBRE. I'm sure you've heard of us. And specifically, I'm on their workplace strategy team. And all we do all day, every day, even before the pandemic, was help to advise our clients on ways of kind of coming up with new workplace strategies, how to create better efficiencies, certainly how to better engage their employees, and just create better places to work. So that's who I am and what we do.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much to join us. CBRE is one of the main sponsors we have here in Brazil, and bring a lot of good content. So go ahead and make your presentation, and we are focused on the questions. So if you have any kind of questions, we are trying to keep like 50 minutes to the end, but sometimes come some good questions. I try to jump directly to the question to keep you warm in the presentation. Cool?
That's perfect. Yes, feel free to do so. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Let's do this again. Here we go. And Renato, could you just give me a verbal yes if you can see the slide?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you. So I want to set some context before I talk about activity-based work, because I think it's important to understand why activity-based work is useful right now and kind of what challenges that activity-based work can uniquely solve at this moment in time. And so, the first thing that I want to make sure that we establish is just that coming out of this pandemic, it's become increasingly clear that hybrid work is an inevitable future for most companies going forward. The last 20 months, 18 months have really been proof of concept for the fact that working from home really works. And so allowing greater flexibility for employees is something that increasingly C-suite executives have been convinced of. And, over time, as you can see, we've been tracking this both pre-COVID and then at several stages throughout the last 20 months. We've been asking corporate occupiers how they feel about the fluidity of work and allowing greater flexibility in where their employees can get work done. And you can see just the steady increases every several months, people coming around and understanding that hybrid work is really here to stay, kind of to the point where we stopped asking this question because it's become so unanimous across the board in all geographies, in all industries, that this is going to be kind of the universal approach in the future, thinking about the balance of working from home and then also working in the office. Now, just because though I say that hybrid work is inevitable, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be one singular solution for everybody going forward. There will be a great diversity in how different occupiers interpret what hybrid means for themselves. And so what we're seeing now as we start to dig into the nuance of what hybrid work is that there are kind of three major categories of different hybrid work models that we're starting to see occupiers drift towards, right? On the most conservative end of the spectrum, the far left, there are those occupiers that interpret hybrid work as more of an office-first kind of model, where they're still assuming that predominantly their employees will work maybe 4 days per week in the office, and then remote work will be more the exception than the rule. It could be because of business travel. It certainly could be because of any kind of work-life balance, right? But they still want to have the majority of their experience be an in-office type of culture. You can see, though, by the percentages that I've ascribed to the spectrums that this is a less popular mode of kind of interpreting hybrid. We're only seeing 19% of our surveyed occupiers say that this is going to be the way that they go, but it is a more conservative interpretation of hybrid work. So that's kind of the far left end. Then on the far right end, kind of the most aggressive way of interpreting hybrid work is called virtual first. Again, this is a less popular selection. Only 8% of our corporate occupiers are saying they prefer this, but it's the exact opposite of office first, where they're saying, well, maybe we only come into the office 1, maybe 2 days a week, maybe 1, maybe 2 days a month, even in some extreme cases, where they're assuming kind of the reasons you're coming into the office might be few and far between. You may be coming on site for training, for all hands meetings, for onboarding, for special events, things like that, very special cases. Now, in the middle, the mushy middle, this is obviously the most popular interpretation of hybrid. It's something that is a little bit more blended, a bit more balanced, where we're saying maybe 2-3 days a week in office and vice versa, remote as well. And the reason that this has become most popular as a way of interpreting hybrid work is obviously because there are benefits to both working on-site and off-site. The benefits of working on-site typically are cited as being enhanced relationships, things like culture, community, collaboration, things of that nature. And then the benefits, obviously, of working remote are just greater flexibility and choice for the employee, things like work-life balance, just health and well-being, right? Ability to remove commute and things like that, all those kinds of really personal considerations that your workforce is going to be considering. So trying to have the best of both worlds and figure out what that right blended mix looks like is what most of our occupiers are grappling with. And it becomes kind of a really important launching point for rethinking then how we address the office to better function within this blended hybrid work model. So
just try to summarize this.
Yeah, quickly.
From an employee perspective, we have shifted the future of the workplace, right? For many employees, the amount of time spent in the office will never return into the pre-pandemic time. Like a lot of people have this question sometimes. And because I think employees embrace the remote work with the autonomy and the save timing that we have, like I spend like 2 hours to go to the office, I don't want to spend 2 hours to go to the office. And some jokes here was like the person we spend 2 hours in the subway play Candy Crush. The only one that would be happy would be the Candy Crush company. The guy will stay in the subway so they can stay with family more time. But however, it's clear the role of the office as a destination for the employee collaboration and keep the corporate culture, something like that, right?
That's right. Yes, that's exactly right. So, what we're seeing then is because this is a more popular way of kind of moving forward, what this obviously then means, Renato, is that we're going to be seeing less occupancy in our offices. So exactly what you mentioned, because it will be tempting to, skip the commute on the subways, because it will be productive to work from home for certain tasks and things of that nature. When we compare to pre-COVID, we saw maybe 70, sometimes in extreme cases, maximum of 80% occupancy for different sites. Once you take into consideration more work from home, more remote work, we expect to see those utilization numbers decrease, possibly in the corridor of anywhere from 30 to 50% on a day-to-day basis. And so what this is going to lead to is obviously a question of how we're using our space and how much space we really need. Because if we only have anywhere from 30 to 50% of our people showing up, but we maintain the same size of our offices as we had in pre-COVID times, the offices will feel very empty, which is, quite frankly, what a lot of people are already seeing right now as we slowly get back to the office, is understanding that, if nobody else is there, if it feels low energy, there's not much that attracts you to the office. It doesn't feel the same as it did pre-COVID. There's not as much that is kind of tempting you to want to be there. And so if we're not careful about kind of the new ways that we design our space, one, we will be paying for space that we're not using, which is not a great use of resources. And two, we will be disincentivizing employees to show up, which could cause even further declines in utilizations. People won't want to be there. They'll feel that the workplace experience is lacking in comparison to working from home. So we constantly have to think of ourselves as, number one, we've got to be good stewards of our financial resources. But number two, we have to think about how we're competing for occupancy, right? There's an allure of working from home. You don't have to put on pants. You can work from the couch. It's very comfortable, right? It's very easy. And so we have to be thinking in nature of what is the value that we're providing from the office, and is it something that we are actually realizing a return on investment for, from dollars dollars and cents perspective, if that makes sense. So how much space you actually need, right? That's the number one follow-up question, right? And they say, okay, well, wait a minute. You're telling me people are only going to be showing up half the time. So does that mean I only need half of my space? And the answer I always give to that just right off the bat is, well, probably not, right? It's not going to be a very even, easy math problem, right? Of saying, well, let's just kind of slice it in half because, we're only going to have 50% of our people. It's a little more nuanced than that. And the reason is because usually, and Renato, you mentioned this as well, a lot of the allure of this remote working paradigm is because there is choice. There's greater ability for employees to control their own destiny, right? And say, well, I want to be able to make good decisions about where and when I work. And that may not be the same every day, or that may not even be the same every single week, right? And so some different ways that we're modeling this, these are representative, so this is not real data, but just it's modeled off of real data, right? I'm showing, well, we could have a scenario where, let's say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, these days are very popular, right? And everybody wants to come in on those days because that's when we schedule meetings. That's when we kind of kick off the week with our teams. That's when clients want to meet. And so we might have really above average numbers of people wanting to come into the office versus then Thursdays and Fridays. Those do tend to be less popular days for coming in because people like the flexibility of perhaps starting their weekend early, and maybe they have family obligations, things like that. And so you could see some, extreme peaks and valleys throughout the week. What you can see across, each of these graphs, though, is all of these are modeling an average of 50% space utilization, right? But they all are telling a different story. So if you were to say, just for example, if you were to get rid of half of your space, right, because you're thinking I've got 50% show up rate, if you model the behavior of the extreme peaks graph on the far left, you'd find yourself with not enough space in the early days of the week because you've got 80, 70% of people showing up. You're going to be bursting at the seams, right? Not enough seats for the people who are showing up. And then you will have too much space on Thursdays and Fridays, right? So it's not very well kind of, equalized. And then, the only way that would actually work out, what we're showing on the uniform show up, is if you control that, if you create something that is, a little bit more manufactured, right? And the way that you get the absolute average 50% every single day of the week would be if you have to say, I'm going to put a shift program in place. And so maybe Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, we have shift A, right? And they're allowed to come into the office. That's half of our employee population. And then Tuesdays and Thursdays, that's another half of the population, that's shift B. And so in that way, we're able to control and say, we will never have more than 50% show up on any given day because we've controlled access to the office based off of those two A and B shifts. So a lot of this depends on behavior. A lot of this depends on policy. A lot of this depends on, frankly, human psychology, right? And so figuring out exactly how much space you need is kind of multivariable in nature, right? Of thinking through, what can we predict about the way people are going to be using the office? When are they going to be using the office? And then furthermore, kind of what kinds of space will they even need when we get there, right? Because it may not also be the exact same design as what we had in the past in order to make sure that people are having their needs met when they do come on site. I'll talk about that in a minute, but I'll just pause there. Renato, if any questions came in, if there's anything I should elaborate on with the math before I move on to some of the design aspects of things.
Yeah, just to talk about, just comment that also depend of the cities, like we did some kind of research here in Latin America. Some cities like Bogota, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, most of the employees say, hey, I want to work from home, like the traffic is terrible. Right. Some cities like Sao Paulo, we have a restriction to drive once a week. Bogota is twice a week, so we cannot get out with the cars on that day. So these also have some kind of changes in the office space usage. So, but others office space that we have in small cities, like I say, no, I prefer to go to the office. Also because these small countries have some technology issues. Some
Right.
countries have more
Right.
better, because nowadays real estate facilities and IT must work together to provide the solutions, because sometimes we have someone in the face-to-face meeting, some people are in the webinar like us, but you are in different pace, in different timing, and different locations. So it will be tricky for the layout and how we can put everyone the same in the same way. Let's say that, something like
That's
that.
right. Yeah. Yeah. To summarize, you're absolutely right. Again, this won't be a one size fits all. There are going to be cultural differences across geographies, right? So, for example, when we think about hybrid in a place like Tokyo, where living spaces, apartments, and houses are very small, right? There's typically not room for a home office. Their willingness to come into a corporate office, is a little bit different than an employee who lives in Texas and has a 2,000 square foot house, because that's very common and popular out there, right? And is able to build a really nice setup. And then there are questions of broadband internet access that also differs across geographies, right? Some countries have faster internet speeds than others, and so working in a corporate environment with enhanced internet may be more appealing. Certainly access to public transportation, that's going to differ across different places. And then there's also a seasonal aspect to how people may want to use an office versus work from home. For example, if you work in a finance department and you're coming up on year end, or there's an audit or something like that, and there's kind of increased need to work with one another, or kind of higher levels of work that you all need to get done as a group, it makes sense to come on site and have that camaraderie and get through things together. Then there may be kind of different moments in time where the way that your occupancy is fluctuating just completely changes, right? And so we have to take into consideration what those fluctuations will be before we start making any calculations of how much space we can get rid of and consolidate to make sure that we're meeting all the needs of the people. Right?
Yeah, like the finance teams, right? Most of the finance teams must to be in the office space and the certain days, the 1 and to 5, the closure of the books and everything. So we must take into consideration, right?
Exactly.
That's great.
But we don't have time to get through all the departments, right? So we'll skip through that. Just quick star on that. It's going to vary. So anyway, the question though, everybody is still looking for ways to save space, right? Because I think the realization at kind of the high level, right, is everybody says, okay, we probably have more space than we need. If we're going to be on site less, we don't know how much less, right? It could vary, as we talked about, but we want to figure out ways to get a skinnier portfolio, right? To save money, particularly as everybody is thinking about the economy, right? And the direction things seem to be going. People are predicting recession could be on the horizon. And so we want to be thinking about how we can kind of tighten our belts, right? Save money, save space, and provide things that are more efficient, right? And so there's really two ways to do this. A lot of organizations are looking at both, right? And both can be impactful. But the first easiest way, right, is to think about how you are designing your space. And you want to make sure that your space standards are as efficient as possible. So the easiest example, for example, law firms are going through this right now as we're thinking about, all right, how big should our offices be, right? Maybe they used to be 300 square feet, and now we're going to make them 150 square feet, right? Chop them in half, things like that. We want to make sure that there's not any space that is wasted or redundant. We're looking at how it's been used, right? And whether it's going to serve a purpose going forward. So everything is kind of moving to the right in terms of efficiency on space sizes and creating more modular spaces and things like that. This obviously is dependent on, some sort of a lease expiration or other kind of transactional event, right? Because it's generally not convenient to be going in and renovating your space if you don't have TI dollars, or, if you're not moving somewhere, right? It can be disruptive to the business to go through and do construction, certainly expensive, right? Especially with lead times and supply chain issues right now. And so that way of saving space is very much schedule dependent, right? Whether where you are in kind of your real estate scenario will allow for that, right? But it's very impactful. And so certainly anytime there's an opportunity to do so, we are seeing occupiers take a look at their space standards. The next one, and this is predominantly what we're supposed to be talking about today, which is activity-based working, is all about desk sharing, right? And thinking about, well, rather than assign one seat for every one person and say, this is Casey's desk and this is Renato's desk. I'm not going to be there every single day. So maybe Casey and Renato, we can share, right? And on the days that I'm there, I use it. On the days that Renato is there, he uses it. And so in that way, a consideration of having fewer desks than there are people at a high level, that's essentially what desk sharing is. And activity-based working is one of many desk sharing models. It's unique in a couple ways though. And I want to talk about that and kind of help highlight what it's meant to solve and kind of how it is operated and applied. I think the first tenet is obviously thinking about what's called a sharing ratio. This is the math that kind of comes into, well, we said fewer desks than people, but how many fewer desks than people? And so the sharing ratio is meant to express the relationship between people and desks as we go through it. And obviously, the higher the sharing ratio goes, the more we expect that people will be working out of the office. So you can kind of see that this chart, it's not a prescription, right? So you can certainly experience some deviation in here, but it's more or less kind of a trend of what we recommend in terms of a sharing ratio based off of the number of days per week that people might be working remote, right? So you can see on the far left end, and this kind of aligns with those hybrid work models, if you're not going to be working remote very often, maybe one day a week, we recommend something like a 1.1, maybe a 1.2 sharing ratio, versus if you're going to be more blended, you could get up to 1.5, 1.6, all the way down to virtual first. That's where we start to see 2+ sharing ratios, right? That get a little bit more extreme in the number of seats that we provide as we go through this. Figuring out what this number is, that's step one for getting through this. There's a lot of fancy math that goes into it. Number one, you've got to think about your risk tolerance, right? Number two, you have to be thinking about what those deviations might be that we talked about, the cyclical nature of business, whether there's going to be strong differences on a Wednesday versus a Friday. And lastly, you've got to be thinking about really what qualifies as a seat. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But first, just a last piece about what defines activity-based working. It's really about choosing the right place and the right space for each task. And I think people commonly get very stuck when they think about remote work. They're thinking about external mobility. They're thinking about working from home versus working in the office. Maybe they're remembering that there could be some peripheral spaces like, oh yeah, I need to be productive when I'm working at an airport lounge, or yes, I need to be productive when I'm working at a client site, right? But they're mostly thinking about the back and forth of work from home and working in the office. But there's kind of another aspect of activity-based working, which I think really differentiates it as a strategy for desk sharing, which is this concept of internal mobility. We want people to also be able to choose the right place for their activities when they are on site. And traditionally, people would think about the way space is designed and they'd say, okay, well, we've got a workstation, we've got an office, and we've got a conference room, right? Those are your choices for where you can work today. And that's very static, right? In comparison, actually most business is very dynamic these days. There are a lot of different tasks that I might take place no matter what role I have. So I'll be on phone calls, I'll be checking email, I'll be conducting research, I'll be conducting professional development type meetings and mentoring people and building relationships and just all kinds of different things. And it would be foolish to expect that any one space type could meet the needs of such a diverse array of tasks. And so what activity-based working really looks to do is it says, I want to think of the office more as an ecosystem, a series of different spaces that are purpose-built to do one thing and one thing really, really well, right? And then we allow employees to move across all those different spaces. I have a quiet place to go if I need to make a phone call. I have somewhere that's got more buzz if I'm looking to collaborate. I have other places that are tech-enabled, some places that are less so, right? Just a whole bunch of different things that can help really enable people to be their best selves and be as productive as they can at work. That's the activity-based part of ABW, and it's the most important piece of things, because if you've read the 5 Myths and Realities article that CBR recently published, I think that's kind of the number one thing that people forget about applying desk sharing is you can't just use your old workplace and expect to be highly successful at desk sharing, because the entire purpose, the entire way that we have been conducting work has been changing over the last decade, honestly. And we want to make sure that we're thoughtful about that as we go through the design. So I'm going to show you just a series of designs. We're wrapping up the presentation now here. This is the direction that we're starting to see designs go in. I won't say that this is 100% exactly what everything has to look like, and there are a few different ways that it could go. But more or less kind of a couple major takeaways about what's interesting about designing for activity-based work. I think number one is this concept of balance, right? You want to make sure you're thinking about the diversity of spaces in terms of which ones are open and which ones are enclosed, which ones are built for the individual versus which ones are built for collaboration purposes, access to natural light, right, as very egalitarian and things like that. And so what we start to see, in some of these different designs, and I'll click through a couple more, is the way that space is allocated, and you can see kind of a high-level breakdown here. We start to see less in this light blue category, which we call me space. So that would be offices and workstations, very traditional. And we start to see more in this category of what we would call we space. So conference rooms, open collaboration areas, places like that. Mostly because, certainly, we want to have the diversity, as I mentioned, but when you think about kind of how the balance skews, right, we're starting to see a little bit more push towards we, because more what you can get done at home, that's more suited for individual tasks, right? So you want to be able to focus and have control of your environment. It's actually very productive to do those tasks at home versus the things that are better on site, the things that the office excels at. Those are more the 3 C's that I've been mentioning: culture, community, collaboration. And so providing kind of a stronger amount of that we space, it just makes more sense for the design.
So now is the opportunity with the activity-based workplaces to create more space to collaborate and keep the company culture than just a space to work, let's say, me activity. So
Yes.
In the past case, it was very common to see that the me activity was a bunch of workstations in an open space, and the meeting rooms are closed. Nowadays, you see a lot of me in a closed space and the we space open, something that is changing, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, here, I'll go back to this because I think you can see it a little bit better. So the me space, that's what's highlighted in this light blue. So these are the workstations, like you're mentioning, typical open office. But there's also a lot of me space in good activity-based design that's behind closed doors. So these spaces are what we would call a focus room, right? So it's kind of a miniature office.
Malls and malls. If you need
Exactly.
to be focused, right?
Exactly. And strategically placed nearby to the workstations, because if I'm dropping in for the day, right, I'll first stop at a workstation and maybe get some coffee and check some emails. And then let's say I get a phone call, I'm going to want to be able to walk quickly and conveniently into one of these spaces so that I have more privacy for that phone call, so that it all kind of functions within easy walking distance. You can kind of see this corner up here would be what we would call a neighborhood, right? So another kind of hallmark of activity-based design is thinking about the cellular components of the overall floor plan of saying, do I have a diversity of space types in each of these neighborhoods, right? So you can see all the different colors that are in the different corners and kind of how they diversely array instead of.
I had the opportunity to implement this activity-based workplace in one company. And the main challenge was the cultural change, because sometimes the leader looks from this focus room and say, this is mine. And then pretty much the opposite. Say, man, you just come to make calls, and if you need, after you finish the call, please leave to other person use it. So This is something that happened a lot, Casey. The culture change must be strong, right?
Absolutely, yes. And so, you have to be prepared for that. This is a behavior change as much as it is a design change when you get down to it. And you can't expect it to happen overnight, right? And so any time that we're implementing this system for clients or for ourselves, there is a really detailed recommendation for change management, which is the discipline behind figuring out how to get people to participate in this, right? And it's everything from, communications to, creating resources to training, right? And some of the kind of intangible psychology aspects of how you kind of convince people to go through this is really important. Going through here, actually knowing that there are always challenges. I did compile a few FAQs, right, that we get when we implement this, because we have seen it all, Renato. I think the amount of resistance that I've seen the crazy questions and the regular questions, but these are the most common ones.
City, a lot of leaders say, no, it's not enough city. I prefer to have my people here.
Exactly. They're nervous, right? They say, well, what if, right? What if everybody shows up, right?
Yeah.
And it's something that's important to be prepared for. So I think, the way that we address this question is kind of two things. One is you have to make sure that you have a way of proving what the utilization actually is. So we're seeing a huge increase in interest in things like sensors and other kinds of occupancy monitoring systems, so that we have real data that we can go to our executives with and say, you're worried about a scenario that hasn't happened in the last 5 years, right? And so we shouldn't be building for something that isn't likely to take place, or if it does, is highly infrequent, right? But you need that number, otherwise the myth, the assumption that leaders will lead them to be risk averse as we go through this, and could cause problems in how you're implementing a system. The other thing you've got to be thinking about, and I alluded to this earlier in the presentation, you have to be thinking about, well, what defines a seat, right? Because the way they're thinking about it is they're thinking about desks, right? They're thinking about offices and workstations. And it's true, in an activity-based working model, you have fewer offices and workstations than you have people. But typically what you're also doing, and you saw this from the designs that I flashed up on the screen really quickly, is you've got a lot of other space types, right? You certainly have conference rooms, perhaps some more informal collaboration seating, different types of shared focus areas, right, that everybody will have access to. Again, it's the ecosystem approach to how this happens. And so you'll typically still see more than enough seats of all different types, offices, workstations, conference rooms, all kinds of things, to accommodate if everybody were magically to show up on one day. In a well-designed ABW environment, there would be places for everybody. You just have to move away from thinking that everybody's going to have an office with their name on the front of it. That's really the biggest shift that's happening. But we're certainly taking into consideration, peak occupancy, right, and thinking through how people are going to be moving through the space. That's FAQ number one. Number two, and this is a really basic one, but people are very concerned about, well, where do I put my stuff, right?
Well, this is the second question all the time. And the third, and the third one is, where is my parking space? That's
yes.
Here, right? But it's another one that people
exactly. I mean, it's a very practical concern. Exactly. Well, because what people are trying to avoid, when they hear that I'm not going to have an assigned seat, that they think, well, I have all of these things that I've accumulated over however many years of my career. I've got trophies and I have files and my laptop and all these things. Am I going to have to carry it around with me in a backpack, like I'm back in college, right? I don't want to be doing that, right? It's not convenient. It's not a good way, especially if I'm moving back and forth between home and in the office every day. But the answer to this is actually very simple. Usually what we move towards in terms of personal storage and files as well is more of a centralized system, as opposed to a storage system where it's in an office or at a particular workstation. So there are still file drawers in activity-based work environments. Typically, it might be assigned to a particular employee, or maybe you have a file room or a set of file drawers that are assigned to HR. Maybe they're under lock and key, for particularly sensitive files, right? But there's no reason why you can't have that out.
legal department asking for space all the time to document.
Exactly.
And you say, man, you must learn about PDF files, like it works well also. And put these in another location. It's very expensive to rent here to put the papers, right? But
it is. Well, the legal industry has made a lot of progress on that, actually. It's difficult, right? Because you have the whole court system that you need to also go paperless before you really can. But yes, everybody's kind of taking the opportunity, exactly as you said. You don't want to be paying premium rent dollars to store files that you maybe access once every couple of years, right? Or maybe worse, that you're just retaining out of some kind of a policy that you have, right? So anyway, that's a whole other story, thinking about offsite versus onsite, centralized versus personalized, right? Files, easy to solve, file drawers distributed throughout the space. Lockers as well is another system that we're seeing be implemented for ABW. Typically, these are assigned on a person-by-person basis, so you'll have a locker somewhere in the floor plan, right? You can set it with a code. A lot of times, they're not very large, right? They're maybe large enough to store a gym bag, your own personal keyboard if you don't want to share a keyboard and a mouse with everybody, things like that. But more and more, we're actually seeing people move to like a library system where there are not a locker for every person, but instead, if I personally want one, then I'll check it out for the week or for the year even, or whatever I'd like. And the reason being is that I think people overestimate how much stuff they really are going to want to bring with them each day. And sometimes what we would find is that the lockers, people would store things in them and then forget about it. So we would have cookies that were going moldy and attracting bugs, and old gym bags that were causing smell problems throughout the system. And so we needed a way to kind of keep the system fresh and make sure that people weren't just putting things in there and just forgetting about it, and it just becomes kind of a junkyard of things that nobody actually really needs.
Yeah, what's very common, the guy go to your locker room and put a lot of things there and just open when you guys leave in the company, has a lot of paper there that say, man, I don't need that. It's good. Put in the trash. So why you not did this in the, years ago, right? Because we don't need too much space to the papers and everything. But it is one of the questions that raised here was the number of locks must be one-on-one, like one for each employee, or you let's say recommend to have lockers that could be shared, or just use if you are in the office. How this work, because of the the mail room, there's all this thing that comes sometimes.
Right. Yeah, again, typically I do recommend still a one-to-one kind of building that amount of lockers. Even if you share them, it is helpful to just have them built so that you can potentially expand in the space and accommodate even more visitors and things like that in the future. Lockers don't take up very much square footage. It's easy to retrofit. It's easy to add them in. So honestly, getting the exact right number of lockers is probably the least of your concerns as you're building an ABW environment. More is more. I think it is helpful. It's a psychological component as well, when people feel like they have control over at least something in the space if they have their own locker, right? So
cool.
Great. This next one, this one's controversial. This one is important, right? Especially since we're coming out of a pandemic. But I've honestly been asked this question even prior to COVID. Is immediately people think, as soon as you start sharing space, you're worried about the ick factor. You're worried that illnesses will spread faster in the workplace, that germs will become a problem. And this is something people are much more aware of now that we've kind of all lived through a global pandemic. But there are kind of a few things that I'll say in defense of desk sharing that actually kind of provide some positives when you think about germ theory in the open office. And the first one, is just the fact that if you have unassigned seating, you're in control of how close or how far away you're working from the next person. So for example, if I come in and Renato, you're sitting at a desk and you're coughing kind of lightly, I can say, I'd rather not sit right next to you, Renato. Sorry about that. I'm going to choose a desk a couple seats away, right? And I'm able to figure out kind of how comfortable I am with sitting near other people. I can move, right? And that's completely your prerogative versus if you were assigned a desk, right? It's kind of down to who shows up each day, right? right? And if you have to move, it's a much more complicated process, right? Because you may be displacing someone else. And so it's just more challenging, right? So that choice allows you to kind of have control over your exposure. The second piece about it, and you'll see this in the video that I'm just about to show, is that activity-based working or unassigned seating, it doesn't mean that you're automatically going to have an office that is packed in with people with sardines, right? I think people assume that because it does enable greater efficiency in your space, then that means that everybody is going to be elbow to elbow when you come in. But it actually frees you up to be able to design more generously, right? And so a well-designed ABW environment is going to have really great circulation, pathways, better spacing between open seats, right? And so that kind of keeps people, again, from being on top of one another and is better for controlling the spread of illness in a workplace. And the last thing, and I think this one surprises people because I don't think they've thought about this as we've enhanced our cleaning protocols through COVID, but something you may not be aware of is that most cleaning crews are instructed that if they see a surface or desk or an office and there are personal items on the desk, it could be papers, it could be a cell phone or something, right? If it's there, they do not clean that surface. And the reason is that they don't want to risk liability as a company of the loss or theft or damage of any sensitive confidential information or certainly personal effects, right? And so cleaning that you think is happening every single day, oh, they're wiping down all the surfaces, may not actually be taking place. But if you're in a desk sharing environment, typically it requires what's called a clean desk policy, which means that at the end of every day, you have to take everything with you, right? So you can't leave any files on the desk. You can't leave your personal potted plant or anything like that, right? And that makes it easy for the cleaning crews to come in every night and do the deep cleaning that they've been hired to do, which in general keeps your entire office at a much better status of cleanliness than it might if you were allowed to kind of accumulate clutter in a personal owned space, right? So
yeah, I love this because it's very important for facility side to have the very clean nowadays after the COVID and all the process we need. I think this as a way to work is much better because at the end of the day, the desk is pretty much clear.
Right.
Because everyone get your things, put in the backpack or put in the locker, and you can make a very deep, clean process than the others that you say like photos and mouse and a lot of things. So I love this one.
Exactly. So last couple things before we get to the video, and then we'll open it to Q&As. Everyone always asks, who's adopting ABW? It's pretty popular right now, as we mentioned. So lots of big names, including CBRE, of course, are moving to implement this. We've been tracking this in our occupier data. It's just passed the tipping point of 50% recently of people who are investigating this. Interestingly as well, when we say that they're adopting ABW, it doesn't mean that everybody in your organization has to participate. CBRE does that because we like to be progressive and experiment and things like that. But other companies on this list are being a little bit discerning, right? And they may say, okay, well, we will do this for our consulting teams, but not for our engineers, or we will do this for the marketing department, but not the lawyers, right? And so it just depends on kind of your organization, what adopting ABW means to you. It could be 20% of your employees, it could be 50%, it could be 100%, right? But going in and testing the waters and starting to think through this is something that's becoming much, much more common. So you won't be in the minority if you choose to do so. And then I just wanted to kind of end on just all these further considerations. Each of these topics is something that I could speak for another hour on, so I will not. But I think it's just important to recognize that when you're implementing ABW, you have to think about it from the perspective of furniture and walls, yes, but also technology, but also behaviors, but also psychology, but also operations, right? There are kind of all these different categories. You have to approach it holistically in order to make sure that all the components are in place to make sure that everything is successful, right? So you can't just stop at figuring out how to design your space. There's a lot of kind of steps along the road to figure this out. And now we get to the point where I'm going to show you a video. This video that I'm about to show you, is of our office in London. It's called Henrietta House. And it was just opened in November of last year, so super recently. It was a pandemic opening. And it's kind of a crown jewel within our portfolio. We've been doing something called Workplace 360 for the last decade, where we've been implementing ABW. Every time we have a lease expiration, we're redesigning the space, moving into desk sharing. And it's been a really great learning experience for us because believe it or not, real estate is actually a pretty conservative industry. And so a lot of the times,
exactly.
what we're coming from is very traditional, right? I mean, even in LA, we had perimeter offices, right? Everybody had their own assigned desk. It was, it looked like a law firm, right? And then we're moving into spaces like I'm about to show you on this video. And so we're very intimately familiar with some of the change issues, the resistance points that people come up with. Even our own employees go through that. But I think, what you see at the end of this is hopefully very compelling. I think people oftentimes think that change is scary, but when they see how beautiful and how functional the design can actually be, it makes them more willing to experiment. So I'm going to hit play.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to visit several offices from CBRE, not only in Latin but also in Europe. I think it was in the London, the one before this one.
Yeah.
And the layout was great, but it was very traditional. This one is pretty new, right?
Exactly. But this is probably anything but traditional. I mean, if anything, the inspiration that we took for this is more from the hospitality sector, right? I mean, this looks like a high-end hotel in some of the areas, right?
It's
I mean,
cozy,
beautiful
right?
work
It's much more
lounges.
cozy than the traditional office that was like formal one, right?
Right. Exactly. But this is far from it. I mean, you see some of the traditional space types, and we have conference rooms, right? There are workstations on the upper floors and things like that. This is a 10-floor building, by the way, so just gigantic, and it's meant to service 2,000 employees in the London area. So quite large. But entirely free address, right? Nobody has an assigned seat. And we built it, again, more for the types of work that they're looking for when they come in. So there are several floors, the ground floor and the 7th floor in particular, that are built to be much more kind of oriented around conferencing spaces for socialization, like this beautiful cafe, right? Special events, things like that, right? So places that you might think that you would rent, but that we have as part of our day-to-day working experience as you go through it. And you can see even just kind of from these renderings, how spacious, how open it feels, right? So you'd never guess that the efficiency here, if you took the square footage and divided it by the head count, right, it's below 100 square foot per person, which is just unthinkable, right? If I was to kind of conjure an image of a 100 square foot per employee office, I would think, oh, it must be very cramped. Oh, it must have very small spaces for everybody. But look at how open and bright, and again, the diversity of spaces that we were able to provide, that you might not even see at double or even triple that efficiency in other kinds of environments.
Yeah, and also with a lot of stairs to connect to the floors.
Oh yes.
And a very open one, so looks great. I saw the video prior to this presentation. I love and I'm willing to go to London again just to come back to the new CBRE office, because the older ones was more traditional, and this one looks great. And also after COVID, you have a lot of requests from leadership to have a more open space, not open space inside the office, but outdoor space. Let's call outdoor space.
Right.
Like use, have some places to sit outdoor.
Yes.
As we have in the past was pretty much all the offices was locked, the windows, you cannot go out. Nowadays, everyone is asking for outdoor space.
That's right.
How do you guys deal with that, with this activity-based workplace, with outdoor space? You put us work seats on. How you guys deal with that, Casey?
Yeah, it's all part of the ecosystem, right? So it's just another type of seat that we provide when we think about outdoor versus indoor or enclosed versus open, right? And so what we have at Henrietta House is we've got these really beautiful kind of open sliding glass doors that opens onto a patio space that has kind of different bench type seating, lounge type seating as well. And I think, the key to that is making sure that it's functional for real work, right? I think sometimes people get very excited about designing kind of residential or hospitality inspired spaces, and they don't think about the reality of having laptops and needing to use technology when you're actually using it for work. And so you have to be thoughtful about things like power access. You have to be thoughtful about the height of work surfaces, right? You don't want to have a coffee table that's so low that you are kind of crouched or perched over it in a way that's not ergonomic, right? And so all those little details come into the way that we design things, the types of furniture that we use, and also the way that we're kind of provisioning the AV.
Great. So I have some questions from the audience. Most of them I think we'll cover some of them, but we have some that are very interesting. Like one of the great aspect that I have in my mind when I talk about this kind of change from, let's say, from a traditional office to activity-based office is the cultural change.
Yes.
The employees must know how to use the new space because it's not the traditional office. So is that example that I gave to you is something that happened in other company I work at, that the leadership believe that the focus room must be used only by the leader, or the guys just put a paper and say, CFO room. I say, man, this is not good. It's not a good example. So the change management process is very important. And how much you believe that is the right timing to start the change management? Because on this particular project, the change management started like 2 months before moving. I say, man, this is so close. We must start, 1 year. 6 months. How much do you recommend, Casey?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, typically we do recommend starting the change management process sometimes up to 18 months in advance. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're talking to employees and training them 18 months in advance, right? That probably is too early because they'll forget, right? And they'll need refreshers as they go forward. But it's a laborious process, right? It requires a lot of intentional planning each step of the way. And if you leave it to the last minute, if you leave it till 2 months out, you'll forget things, right? I mean, it's just human nature. You need time to get leadership buy-in. You need to get time to conduct the trainings. You need to get time for the communications. You need to create welcome guides. You need to troubleshoot FAQs, right? I mean, I could really go on, but there is kind of a long list of things that kind of go into making sure that day one, you open those doors and everything works very smoothly. You know what to do if a problem arises, right? And all of that is best done over the course of kind of a long lead up so that you make sure that everybody who needs to be involved can be involved.
Got it. Other question that come, Case, is pretty much like you already implemented this kind of office. Of course, we can solve this one. You already have a time to measure the efficient of that, and what kind of system you measure. You use something like a Wi-Fi measure or heat map. What you recommend to measure? Because sometimes we do some space, looks great, right?
Yeah.
Looks amazing. I say, man, I would like to sit here and work.
Yeah.
But it depends of culture not working well. I also give example all the time for the coffee area.
Right.
It's very common to the people, large coffee area. And in some culture, it's very common that people work in the coffee area.
Yeah.
That works well. But in other culture, like I give example from Brazil. If you go to the coffee area, it to talk everything except to work.
Right.
About soccer, about everything. And sometimes the architect put the coffee area to work and stay empty because the people don't go there to work. They prefer to work in other places. The coffee area is really relaxing area. So you already have some kind of did you have any kind of a measure now from this office? What working, what not working?
Yeah.
Just try to highlight this.
Yeah, there's nothing better for metrics than sensors, right? So that's kind of the number one, mostly because if you can use badge data, right? So from the security turnstiles that you saw, for example, in the video, but that's only going to tell you if somebody came to the office each day. But maybe you came to the office and you stayed there all day, and I came to the office and I only stayed for an hour. It doesn't have a way of differentiating that. The sensors will tell you how long you were at the office, and it will also tell you which spaces you used. Did Casey use the cafeteria? Did Renato use a conference room, right? It tracks you throughout the space. Now, on top of that, though, that data doesn't tell the full story, and you alluded to some of it, right? We want to understand not only the amount of occupancy, but we want to know the kind of quality of the work that got done while it was there. So there's really no substitute for just kind of going in and making sure that you're engaging with the population that you're designing for. You can't be afraid to ask questions in focus groups, in surveys. I know sometimes that scares leadership because they're just worried about inviting negative feedback. But I have news for you. The negative feedback exists whether you ask for it or not. It's better to be aware of it, to know specifically what it is so that you can act intelligently on it.
I fully agree with you, Casey. Sometimes people are afraid of the change because they don't want to listen the feedback, but it's there.
Exactly.
You can listen and just say, I don't know about, I'm just spend a lot of money with this office. Enjoy it. Right. But it sometimes is not working pretty well. So one of the other questions that come to us is pretty much like, if I was a customer, what you recommend to move for a traditional straight to the activity-based workplace, or have a kind of a, let's say, midterm, or how you can say to a traditional one? Because most of the countries in Latin America, they still have like a traditional office space.
Right.
Because of the culture, the guys say, no, I'm measuring my power in the company based on this, how much it's the space I have in my private room, my private cafeteria. So how you approach this kind of people to say, man, of course, activity base is too much. Maybe you have a midterm. I don't know. Tell me.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you the experience that I have from our own downtown LA office, because again, real estate is a conservative industry, and LA in particular across the company has a reputation for being a little bit more old school in the way that we operate, right? I mean, brokers out here are still wearing full suits with pocket squares, right? I mean, it's that kind of a culture going out here. So there was a lot of skepticism as we moved into this. And they very nearly told us, no, you can't do it. But the way that we kind of approach that is kind of three major things. Number one is we engaged everybody early on, right? Especially people who were most resistant, right? We wanted them to have a voice at the table. Number one, so that we could collaborate with them, right? And really kind of understand what makes them tick. But number two, and this was sneaky of us, because when somebody participates in creating something, they feel more ownership of it, and they're more likely to feel positive about it later, right? It's proven psychology. We know that's the case. So we made sure that they said, hey, if you've got something to say, you have to be part of the solution, right? You can't just drop negative feedback and run off and expect somebody else to do that. So that's part one. Part two is we committed to a campaign of education, right? And fortunately now, when we were doing this in LA, this was 10 years ago, activity-based working was still relatively new, right? And good examples were hard to come by. But we literally put leaders on a plane, and we did a global tour, and we showed them the best examples of what this could be to inspire them, to get their feedback of what they like and what they would change, right? And that became kind of really eye-opening for them, rather than having them make assumptions of what they think it will look like, or honestly not have any idea, because a lot of these leaders, they don't work in real estate every day. They have a day job, right? We need to make sure they know what we're talking about. That's part two. And then the last part, the interim, between going from traditional to full force ABW, is we did build a pilot space in our old traditional office. We took a corner of it and we said, we're going to wipe everything out over there. We're going to build a little bit of a taste of what activity-based working could look like. We're going to allow you to experiment and think about things and give us feedback along the way. And that helped them feel more comfortable. Then when we moved into the full environment, they knew exactly what to expect. There were no surprises, right? They felt like they had been cooks in the kitchen right alongside with us. And it was just a much more congenial kind of moment of coming together, of saying, here are the fruits of all of our labor, rather than saying, we're doing something to you, surprise, hope you don't hate it.
Yeah, Casey. So basically, I am the, let's say, CBRE customer for a long time, since I work in several companies. I love CBRE, and you guys have a very strong research team to looking for what's come from the future. Could you share with us what do you think that what you think that come from the future for activity-based workplace? what is the next step? How will be? Because, technology is improving all the time. Maybe in the future, I just put some glasses to work like an Iron Man guy, just put the glasses and work. So I would like to understand what you guys are thinking about the future of the office space in terms of usage and layout and how will be the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are kind of three major predictions that we've been talking a lot about with our research team. I think the first is thinking beyond activity-based is this new concept of event-based design, right? So really kind of thinking about the office as not places where you necessarily go to check emails, not places where you go make phone calls. Most of this happening at the office, but we're building great spaces for client showrooms, great spaces for employee training, great spaces for hosting Thanksgiving dinner, those kinds of things, and making that the new purpose of the office. The second one is about technology. There's a huge prediction out there about how we need to kind of advance the workplace around mixed presence collaboration. And if you look on CBRE's website, we recently published a really fantastic white paper about mixed presence collaboration. I wrote it, so that's why I'm biased towards it. But anyway, it talks about kind of what does it look like to bridge the physical and the digital world. It's really great that I'm connecting with you in Brazil, Renato, but what if you had 5 people with you in the room and I was the only one who was virtual? That can be really uncomfortable, right? So how do we make those meetings great?
That was my next question. You answered me. Thank you.
Exactly. So we need to figure that out. And, technology plays a role in that. Design plays a role in that, behavior as well. But that's kind of a new frontier. And then the last one is really kind of about more specific products, because of the fluidity of movement across space and how demanding everybody has become about data and data-driven decisions. We're predicting an increase in kind of live data collection and live data sharing as a way of helping people make really smart decisions. And what I mean by that is we're seeing an uptick in requirements or requests for tools that kind of will allow me to say, like, let me look on my phone and let me say, oh, Renato is in the office today. I'm going to decide to go into the office. Let me grab lunch. And then I send you a message and say, hey, it'd be great to see you, right? Versus having technology that can only measure retroactive and say, oh, Renato was in last week. Well, I wish I had known that then. I would have made a better decision, right? So.
Oh, I love the idea. It would be great, because maybe the office must be the location to collaborate. So if technology help us to know where we are, and if you are in the office, everyone know, would be great, because it will be an opportunity to talk with each other. So,
exactly.
I just would like to thank you so much for your time, for your all the knowledge that you share with us was priceless, was amazing. I'm passionate for this workplace discussion since we had this pandemic. I think it just accelerates some of the trends that we are seeing nowadays. I work on this market for a long time, and we already saw some layout that was implemented on the activity-based workplace and works well. I love it. The way I try to implement here in my company that I work nowadays, this share ratio in most of the offices, the new offices we are doing. And just like, thank you so much for you to also to CBRE to allow us to have your knowledge here. And let's keep in contact. And if someone would like to talk to you, or if you'd like to have a copy of our presentation just to share and ask you to talk to you, because you are a great experience, have a great experience in the layout in the workplace, and will be very, very good to everyone has CBRE working on this one for this site, okay?
Yes, please do share the slides. It even has a link to a more professional video of Henrietta House in there. And I would welcome anybody reaching out and connecting with me further. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Casey. So now I will switch a little in Portuguese to talk about the next event.
Great.
Don't worry. Thank you so much. Pessoal, muito obrigado pela participação. Semana que vem, dia 28, às 9 horas da manhã, café da manhã, na Tia Von Hart, para ouvir a Camila Nagai, para falar para a gente. E eu gostaria muito de ter a presença de vocês nesse evento presencial. E no dia 14 de julho, próximo mês, vamos voltar a ter mais um webinar para falar um pouco sobre branding, Depois, 21 de julho, para falar sobre data, que a gente estava falando aqui com a Casey, né? Dados, como recolher os dados para a gente medir se o escritório está funcionando ou não. Então, continue com a gente, fique ligado e até o próximo evento. Tchau.